I wrote a book about Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is one of those interesting characters who was considered probably in his day and for half a century afterwards the greatest figure of his times. Andrew Jackson was often spoken of simply as the hero. He was the successor to George Washington. If some of you heard me talk before, I may be repeating myself, so forgive me. But when I was working on Andrew Jackson, on the book about Andrew Jackson, I tried to come up with a gauge as to how popular Andrew Jackson was. I might point out, for those of you who recall your history, that of all of the commonly labeled eras of history, the colonial era, the Revolutionary era, the early national period, the Civil War era, Reconstruction, the Progressive era, the New Deal, and so on, there's only one that's named for an individual, and that's the Jacksonian era. He was so emblematic of his times that we've labeled the entire period from the 1820s through the 1840s the Jacksonian era. And so when I was trying to figure out how popular Andrew Jackson was, I decided to come up with a rough and ready measure for how you evaluate historical reputations. And so I took out an atlas of the United States, and I flipped to the index at the back. And I looked at all the places that are named Jacksonville, Jackson Hole, Jackson County, Lake Jackson, and so on. And I added up all of the Jacksons, and then I went to see how that rated with other sort of same names. And in fact, there are more places named for Andrew Jackson than for anybody else, any other individual in American history. Do you know who the second place is?
Washington?
In fact, it's just about a toss-up between Washington and Franklin. And so anyway, Andrew Jackson, though, is no longer considered to be such an important figure as he once was. Well, I take it back. He's still considered by students of the presidency, historians, to be important, but he's not loved. And this is something that's important to keep in mind as we go forward into the election. Because I'm sure I will repeat myself more than once between now and Wednesday evening, but we choose our presidents. We vote for candidates for president for one set of reasons. And it has as much to do with how they make us feel emotionally as it does with their mastery of politics or policy or anything like that. And then they have to be president, and that requires a different set of skills. Well, anyway, historians still think that Andrew Jackson was an important figure, but it's really hard to find any historians who like Andrew Jackson. Because Andrew Jackson was wrong on some issues that we think we've become more enlightened about. In the first place, Andrew Jackson, like Thomas Jefferson, like every other Southerner elected to the presidency before Woodrow Wilson, and I'll have some things to say about Wilson on this score too, was a slave owner. And we're in an enlightened age, and we like to think that we're going to put some distance between ourselves and those people in the past who owned slaves. And so we can't really get very close emotionally to slave owners. So that's one mark against it. He was a militant expansionist. Andrew Jackson, by force of arms, conquered Florida, essentially illegally conquered Florida, and was instrumental in bringing Texas into the United States. Texas, which of course separated itself from Mexico. So Jackson expanded the American national domain by force of arms. And we like to think of ourselves as a peace-loving people, and we like to somehow imagine that this country spread from coast to coast by accident or by divine gift or something. No, as a matter of fact, this is the way the country was built. It was built by military conquest. But we'd just as soon not be reminded of that. The real mark, the big thing that's held against Andrew Jackson, was his Indian policy. And in fact, I often speak to groups of school teachers. And I'll speak to high school teachers and occasionally to elementary school teachers. I was speaking to a group of elementary school teachers in Illinois last summer. And I posed this question. I asked it to a lot of groups, but I remember this particular group. And I said, well, what do you, or more precisely, what do your students know about Andrew Jackson? And the answer came back from several of the teachers there. These are elementary school teachers. And they gave me 3 words. And do you know what the 3 words were? Trail of Tears. Andrew Jackson's role in the forced removal of the Cherokees from Georgia. And so this is what people know about Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was, well, he's perceived to be anti-Indian. Now, I have to explain that Andrew Jackson wasn't anti-Indian. In fact, Andrew Jackson adopted a couple of Indian children as his own, Indian kids who lost their parents. And he raised them as his own. Andrew Jackson, however, did believe that it would be very difficult for Indians to live as tribes, as independent nations under their own laws within the territory of American states. And in this regard, Jackson was simply acknowledging the reality of his times. Now, from a distance of 150 years, it's easy for us to say, and accurately so, that the Indians really got the raw end of the deal in their relations with the rest of the country. And it's certainly true enough. But what was the alternative? Andrew Jackson sketched out the alternative when the Cherokees wanted to stay in Georgia. He said, when the first English colonists arrived at the beginning of the 17th century, there were hundreds of tribes. There were tribes in New England, there were tribes in New York, there were tribes in Pennsylvania, there were tribes all up and down the East Coast. He said, where are they now? He was speaking in the early 1830s. Where are they now? And the answer was, they've all disappeared. They've died of disease, they've been crushed in war, they've been driven from their homelands. Where are they now? He told the Cherokees, and the other so-called, as they were called in those days, the 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast, if you want to maintain your identity as tribes, you're going to have to go where you're not going to be surrounded by white people. Jackson knew the folks who lived in Georgia because he'd grown up among them. And he knew that if the Cherokees stayed in Georgia, the Cherokees would go the way of those hundreds of other tribes that had disappeared. You could call it, if you want, a species of an early example of tough love. But Jackson recognized if the Cherokees want to survive, they're going to have to move. In fact, the Cherokees did move, and it was a tragedy. It was disgrace the way they were moved. They did move, however, and they are one of the most thriving today of the Native American nations. Now, the point of all of this is that we might wish, and when I was hoping for good sales for my Andrew Jackson book, I might have wished that Andrew Jackson hadn't been a slaveholder, that he hadn't been this militant expansionist, that he hadn't had such a harsh policy regarding the Indians. But in fact, if he hadn't had those policies, if he hadn't had those views, he would not have been president. He would not have had all those towns named, and lakes and mountains named for him. The point here is that Jackson suited his times very well. Oh, wait a minute, there's more than that. Because you don't become a great president simply by suiting your times. This lecture is called the half-step rule, because I really do mean the half-step. You've got to be a half-step ahead. If you're behind, well, that doesn't get the country anywhere. And if you only reflect what people want at the time, that doesn't move the nation at all either. Jackson was important because Jackson embodied the advent of democracy, the idea that ordinary people could not only be represented, but could actually control the government. Jackson was the person who gave the presidency to the American people. And the presidency has never been the same since.